Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Apologies, I stopped you talking last night at the drinks reception. I'm stopping you talking again this morning. I'm getting a bit of a reputation, I think, at this stage. My name is Julia Kushla and I'm the Southern Co-Chair of Scotans. And as we make our way through day two, we're delighted to welcome you all back together as a group, and we hope you've enjoyed the paper sessions. I know there was lots of discussions in the room I was in, and I really hope that you've enjoyed listening to different people's perspectives on our theme, because it's a big theme as we're learning, and as we hear more and more presentations, I think our understanding of it is getting deeper and deeper, and the list of questions is getting longer and longer, which is good. This morning, I'm delighted to welcome our second keynote speaker, Dr. Tom Walsh from Maynooth University. And Tom is bringing many lenses to his presentation today and to his interpretation of our conference theme. Tom was a teacher, a researcher, an inspector, policy advisor, curriculum advisor, IT initial teacher educator, an author. I'll keep going, Tom. You paid me to say 20. PhD supervisor, and just to throw it in at the end, a Fulbright scholar. So many different lenses there, so much experience, and we're all looking forward, Tom, to hearing your interpretation of our theme. So I'll hand over to you.
Great. So good morning, everyone, and after such an introduction will probably come great disappointment in terms of expectations. So thank you so much to Julie, to the planning committee, and great to see so many friends from near and far here today. It's a great privilege to be invited to be a keynote address at the Scotans Conference and to be among you in this really salubrious resort of Lochgarn. Míle buíochas as an gcurú agus Tom Harveh áthasach a bheith live. Now, I'd look at my slides. So, indeed, while it's a great honour and privilege to be asked to deliver a keynote, I must say the initial joy and feelings of self-importance have been tempered in the quiet moments of panic and trepidation over the past few weeks, as I wondered what I might say to all of you, such an esteemed gathering of teacher education colleagues and experts. And I think the very low point has been nearly the last 2 days hearing all of the really generative and really interesting contributions, and I think so many people could be up here in my stead. But it is really, really delighted to be among so many colleagues and friends. So moving then to the theme of the conference, and before that, I think it's important to introduce myself and my own positionality around education, because I think that's really important in terms of how that impacts on my own perspectives and potential biases, maybe assumptions, or indeed misconceptions. So as Julie has pointed out, some of the hats I've worn around the landscape in terms of being a teacher, an early years researcher, policymaker, schools inspector, and a teacher educator. And I suppose particularly around the teacher education role, my research has focused on that intersection between history of education and the contemporary education policy landscape, and particularly around the issues of curriculum and teacher education. All of those experiences have shaped who I am, my beliefs around education, and I'm going to try and interweave some of those professional insights along the way. Another caveat, and maybe an apology though, I have to admit that while my historical knowledge relates to the entire island of Ireland, my contemporary experience and understandings relate primarily to the Republic of Ireland. So I'll try my best to relate what I'm saying to both jurisdictions on our shared island, and at least prompt reflections across sectors and relating to issues of convergence or divergence north and south. And I do want to say a big thank you to Professor Noel Purdy, who has helped me out along the way in terms of recent developments in Northern Ireland. So, in terms of structure then, over the next 40 minutes or so, my plan is to focus on the conference theme, a new era of professionalism, identity, authenticity and agency, from both a historical and a contemporary perspective. I hope that in the historical section, I'm going to try and demonstrate that this conference theme could have been used at many junctures in our history over the past 200 years. There have been many new eras of professionalism, as we'll see. And to do that, I'm going to focus on key milestones and turning points as they relate to teacher professionalism. The second half of the address then will look at the more contemporary landscape of teacher professionalism, looking at some of the possibilities, but also the challenges inherent within the current policy landscape. And I know there's lots of different ways we can approach the issue of teacher professionalism. We can look at it through maybe the lens of legislation, through regulation, professional standards, many other ways. But for today, the lens I'm going to look at both the historical and the contemporary eras is through primary school curriculum documentation. I'm going to use that as a tool to examine how the philosophical, conceptual, structural and content changes in the curriculum have impacted on the conceptualization of teachers and their professional roles and identities over time. And indeed, there's an interplay here between the curriculum shaping professionalism, but also teacher professionalism shaping the curriculum. And that's a point we'll return to later. Also, just to say, I'm conscious of the fact that the curriculum itself, the document, is but a statement of the intent, and that the lived reality for many teachers was undoubtedly different. But I think understanding the intent is fundamentally important around teacher professionalism. So back in our time machine we go, and I've put a little timeline up here to support you, I suppose, in navigating this historical piece of it. Needless to say then, there have been educators and teachers who've endeavoured to develop, record and transmit knowledge and understanding long before there were schooling systems and teachers as we understand them today. But we begin our journey around 1800, when the landscape of schooling across the entire island of Ireland comprised a complex array of about 11,000 schools, each with varying underpinning motivations. So some were state or church sponsored, and Viv spoke yesterday about the state involvement in teacher education. So state has been involved from early on. But the vast majority of the schools at that time were locally organised hedge schools where the teacher was hired and paid directly by parents. So teachers working in that system prior to 1831 were quite a diverse group with varying levels of educational attainment, ability and professionalism as we might understand the concept today. They were generally more educated than the wider population and occupied a pivotal role in local communities where their educational attainments and insights were respected. So the following summary from Dowling that you see on the screen there captures the role of the hedge school master. Most of them were male at that time, which we can see stretch far beyond the confines of the classroom or indeed the hedge. As we read, his social standing among the people whose children he taught were remarkably high. He was one of themselves, but different in the respect that he was a man of some learning. They regarded him as a friend whose counsel was to be sought in all circumstances of stress and difficulty, and whose decisions in important matters carried weight. No function of consequence, a wedding, a christening, or a harvest home took place at which he was not a prominent figure. So in this context, hedge school teachers had a high status and exercised high levels of autonomy, as schools were independent of any system of control at that time. It was really indeed state and church concerns over that lack of control and the perceived liberal character of the teachers of the time. It was termed by Hickman as a crisis of order that catalysed the establishment of a national system of education across the island of Ireland in 1831, and it was overseen by the National Board. The state saw the potential of schools and their teachers to be sources of and instillers of civility, obedience and deference to lawful authority among pupils. And equally, the churches saw the role of the teachers to be really powerful advocates in terms of imbuing religious values and to ensuring loyal adherence to the faith. And central to this new system of education was the selection, training, recruitment and management of teachers with the correct disposition and temperament for the role, placing a very strong focus on both the character of the teacher as much as their pedagogical potentialities. So very, very strong emphasis on that moral character. Alongside the new training avenues, the National Board developed extensive and elaborate rules to underpin the national system, including the desirable characteristics of what it was to be a teacher, and they culminated in the 12 practical rules for teachers from 1845 that some of you might be familiar with. These were underscored very much by imperial values and very much envisioned the role of the teacher as a model of civility, respectability, obedience and loyalty. So as early as 1835, as you see there on screen, the National Board had articulated its vision for what this new teaching profession would look like. They will be living in friendly habits with the people, not greatly elevated above them, but so provided for us to maintain a respectable station, trained to good habits, identified an interest with the state, and therefore anxious to promote a spirit of obedience to lawful authority. We are confident that they would prove a body of the utmost value and importance in promoting civilization and peace. So I'm sure you're reflecting and self-auditing there to see would you have made the cut in 1835. To oversee the system then, the board established a national inspectorate quite quickly in 1832 to be what O'Haydon calls the eyes and ears of the board. And locally, the managers, largely clerical managers, also had a very strict oversight role of the work of teachers. The inspectors themselves not only oversaw the quality of teaching and learning in schools, but they placed a big emphasis on monitoring the character of the teacher and their standing both as an educator and as a member of society. So, as you can see there, the concern with the teacher character is evident in the instructions for inspectors. These ones are from 1855. So, you can see the inspector, without seeming officiousness, unbecoming intermeddling, or too much curiousness, very, very good attributes for all inspectors, should as far as possible inform himself of the general character borne by the teachers in his district, the estimation in which they are held by the people of their locality, their social position, and their conduct as members of society. So this line of inquiry went far beyond the professional competence of the teacher and highlights the interests of both the state and the church from the very beginning, with both the political and the moral character of the teachers within the system. Attempts then to strengthen that control over teachers and the content of education led to the system of payment by results introduced in 1872 and up to 1900. So as you can see on the screen there, the majority of teacher salaries were now determined and paid based on the results of individual examinations, sort of class by class and subject by subject. So a consequence for that 30 years was that very strong emphasis was placed on instruction that involved memorization, regurgitation of information for exams, that children would undertake individually by the visiting inspector. For me then, one of the most heartening hiatuses came in relation to the status quo and around teacher identity and professionalism with the advent of the revised programme of instruction. So we have a few revised programmes and revised curricula. The first revised one was in 1900 though. In a quite radical move for the era, what could be characterised as a child-centred and broad-based holistic curriculum was introduced from 1900 to 1922, emphasising the role of the child as a discoverer of learning. In tandem then, the role of the teacher was transformed to be more a facilitator rather than a transmitter of knowledge. In the context of the era, this greatly challenged many teachers' own understanding of their role and indeed parental expectations around the role of schooling. But the policy intent was very clear in 1900, that greater trust and autonomy was to be afforded to teachers at a local school level. And the following extracts, I suppose, from that 1900 curriculum exemplify the spirit of that the commissioners provide on their book list a variety of learning books and that teachers have great freedom of selection. Prior to that, there was a very constrained reading list for schools. Secondly that the programme is specified for each subject is not obligatory, but is merely an indication of the aims and desires of the commissioner. So it's very broad-based, it was open to the interpretation then at a local level. In reality though, much of the progressive thinking regarding the role of the teacher was not enacted in practice, and wider regulatory and accountability systems such as inspection and teacher management did not reorient to allow this new vision of the conceptualisation of the teacher to take hold. So to summarise then, pre-partition in Ireland, the work of teachers was largely characterised by a culture of surveillance and oversight from the national and the local level, framed by detailed rules and regulations, and it eliminated much of the independence of thought and action that had preceded the national system. And it reminds me, Viv, of what you were saying yesterday around that sameness. It was, I suppose, a quest to bring some sameness and uniformity and homogenization to the workforce. Collectively then, the control of the churches and the state was far-reaching and extended both inside and outside the classroom life of teachers. For those admitted to the profession before 1922 and for those remaining within it, an adherence to rules and regulations and a deference to authority were prerequisites to survival or progression for teachers. So, time doesn't really allow for a very detailed analysis following partition north and south, but I'm just going to give you a quick flavour of some of those milestones. In the Republic, and the newly established Free State initially, the gains made in terms of a teacher autonomy within the 1900 curriculum were reversed really quickly. The advent of political independence situated schools and teachers at the forefront of establishing and nurturing a new national identity to the curriculum, central to which were Catholicism and nationalism. Indeed, it was not only a professional requirement, but a national duty for teachers to support the state's nation-building efforts. The teacher-centred and subject curricula introduced in the 1920s and implemented until the 1970s were largely centred on transmission and memorisation, with the teacher viewed as the conveyor of unquestionable knowledge to the passive child. The section on religious education from the 1920s is particularly insightful on the role of the teacher. It stated that the role of the teacher was to inculcate moral virtues and to ensure the moulding to perfect form of his pupil's character. In terms of a teacher professionalism, a lot of that flexibility and trust that had been inherent prior to that was replaced by a more stringent set of guidelines for both teachers and for children. The next significant development south of the border was the introduction of the new curriculum in 1971. And again, it represented another pendulum swing in terms of teacher conceptualization, now again as a facilitator of learning with flexibility and freedom to adapt the curriculum locally. Such a vision for teacher professionalism was developed and augmented further in the 1999 curriculum, which has been enacted in schools since then. Both implicit and explicit within the 1999 curriculum is a view of the teacher as an agentic professional who makes informed decisions to respond to the needs of children in the class and the wider school context. So you can see that quote there, making judgments and decisions about the choice of content, the way different elements of content are combined, and the sequence in which they're introduced. Another thing to point out, though, is that the 1999 curriculum had what we might call an extensive physical face, a term by Alexander and Flutter. It had nearly 2,842 pages of guidance, which were subsequently augmented with other materials, guidelines, action plans, strategies, toolkits, and the likes. So it had come a long way from the 14 pages in 1922. But the key point then is that this extensive set of guidance had implications for teacher agency in terms of space for local adaptation and decision making when you have so much centralised guidance coming at teachers. If we go north of the border then following partition, the overall trajectory in terms of conceptualizations of teacher professionalism was not radically different. As evidenced in the Lynn Committee report and the Programme for Instruction for Public Elementary Schools, schools were similarly seen in the 1920s as key sites to establish and reify the new national identity for the majority population of the 6 counties. In this instance, consolidating the allegiance and character of pupils in line with British norms. In this role then, transmission and inculcation of knowledge and values were central to the role of the teacher within a clearly defined curriculum. While there were some revisions post-World War II, which introduced the 11+ examination and other reforms, 1989 represented the first major transformation in the conceptualization of teachers in the curriculum when a statutory national curriculum framework was introduced. This provided detailed guidance to inform teacher professional practice and broad guidance. So we can see there the current curriculum framework for Northern Ireland dates from 2007 and it positions a teacher as a reflective professional who supports both academic and holistic development with a view to fostering children's skills, dispositions and attitudes. Modification of that curriculum is encouraged to provide all children with relevant and challenging work. And we see that in the quote that teachers have considerable flexibility to make decisions about how to best interpret, combine the requirements so as to prepare young people for a rapidly changing world. So it's a bit of a whirl-stop tour through history, but at least it establishes some backdrop for the changing conceptualizations of teacher professionalism to date. And I now want to move to the more current landscape for teacher professionalism. It's interesting to note that north and south of the border were moving at different times. The Republic has recently conducted a redevelopment of the primary school curriculum, while Northern Ireland has recently commenced its review process. So let's begin with Northern Ireland, and after outlining the progress to date there and some of the tentative implications for teacher professionalism, I'm then going to focus on the experience in the Republic of Ireland in recent years and the potential impact and implications for teachers of curriculum developments there. So, as Minister Given detailed yesterday, a series of educational reviews and reforms have been underway in Northern Ireland in recent times across lots of aspects of the education system. From a curriculum point of view, Lucy Crahan has completed the strategic view of the Northern Ireland curriculum in June, and that has informed the current Transform Ed strategy and delivery plan. And coming out of that strategic review, 5 key principles for the new curriculum in Northern Ireland are advocated. That'd be purpose-led, knowledge-rich, continuous and coherent, specific and focused, inclusive and flexible. And the review in particular has highlighted as a weakness the lack of specificity on what should be taught and the impact on teacher workload by devolving curriculum design and planning to individual teachers. So there is a proposal that an emphasis on teacher agency will be maintained alongside more specific guidance, and I quote, on important knowledge and how it is sequenced within the curriculum. So the timeline there shows the next important steps in the curriculum review, and it's quite an ambitious timeline relative to the pace of developments in the South. A curriculum task force chaired by Christine Council is currently working on the development of the curriculum, which is planned for implementation in all schools from 2027. So, coming back to the Republic of Ireland, a redeveloped primary school curriculum with accompanying curriculum area specifications have just been recently published and introduced to schools as of last month effectively. It's been in preparation for close to a decade, and the process has involved learning from a range of strands like research, consultations, seminars, networks, deliberations, and involved children, parents, teachers, wider professionals, support services, and wider parties then. And a lot of what I'm going to say over the next while emanates from my own experience being a member of the NCCA advisory panel for the redevelopment of the primary school curriculum. It's been a massive learning journey and a great privilege for me to work alongside Professors Louise Hayward, Jim Spillane, Dominic Wise, and many NCCA colleagues, some of them here, Tracy and Derek and others, as we, I suppose, have learned together in terms of the big issues and the big questions around curriculum redevelopment. So before heading into some of the implications of this for teacher professionalism, a little by way of context. This is the 4th substantive change in the Republic of Ireland in terms of curriculum since independence. For teachers who've worked in the previous curriculum since 1999, there can be a strong emotional connection, and that affective domain is really important because that curriculum has probably served them well and informed their professional practice for sometimes decades now. One of the most fundamental shifts that it represents really is that the primary school curriculum is now a curriculum framework, which delineates broad learning outcomes for children rather than the detailed set of objectives that were there previously. And that has implications for us understanding what a curriculum is, how it looks, and what it actually does for teachers. This conceptualization of the curriculum is something that is constantly evolving, adapting, developing, being shaped by teacher professional judgment and pupil choices, requires something quite different of teachers working with it, who have historically been conceptualized maybe as more implementers of a more centralized and detailed curriculum. In the new curriculum framework, teachers are explicitly positioned as committed, skillful, and agentic professionals who make informed decisions about what, when, and how to teach. This framing reflects a shift towards more explicitly valuing teachers' professional judgment and contextual responsiveness. Other features of the curriculum include a much reduced level of detail by using broad learning outcomes. I added up the pages only recently. It's 434 pages, so considerably less than the 99 curriculum. An emphasis on child agency, a revision of the range and grouping of subjects to facilitate new subjects and further integration, as well as more flexible time in terms of how that is used. So, what are the implications of that then for teacher professionalism if we look at it through the lens of the curriculum? I see four overarching and perhaps interrelated implications. First of all, revisiting one of the key words from yesterday, the emphasis on teacher agency. Secondly, looking at teachers as curriculum makers. Thirdly, the need for system-wide change and learning and support. And last of all, around individual and collective professional learning and support. So we're going to take a look at each of those and their implications for teachers going forward. So globally, teacher agency is increasingly recognised as a cornerstone in curriculum redevelopment. We see this in curriculum development in many countries, but also in lots of transnational frameworks like the OECD Learning Compass, teacher competence frameworks developed by the EU. And this position of teachers is how it has landed within the redeveloped primary school curriculum. In terms of exploring the term agency, and I know I've used agency and autonomy quite deliberately at various times today, I see a difference between both terms. I see autonomy in simple terms as the freedom to act, whereas agency is more that capacity to act. So while I think of the hedge school masters and some of the earlier teachers in the profession had a lot of autonomy, I wouldn't see them as being agentic given their own individual circumstances and the wider context in which they worked. And we'll come to that a little bit more in a while. But moving back to agency then, at its core, it refers to that capacity to act. A lot of scholars have written extensively on this. Biesta and Tedder argue that agency is not a static trait, but an achievement, something individuals or collectives do within specific personal, professional, structural, or cultural contexts. More recently then, Maniquina and Wise, both based in UCL, they draw on the work of Archer and Giddens to define agency as the socially situated capacity to act. And they outline four interrelated dimensions to illustrate how agency manifests itself. First of all, the contextual, encompassing the socio-cultural, the institutional settings, from school level dynamics right up to national policy. These shape the expectations and the resources available to teachers. Secondly, then there's the intrapersonal, including teachers' self-beliefs, motivations, self-efficacy, and their confidence in working with the professional capacity that directly influences their capacity to act agentically. Thirdly, then, looking at the interpersonal, relating to relationships with students, colleagues, principals, and external actors like inspectors or support services. Collaborative cultures and trust-based professional networks support agency to shared problem solving and dialogue. And last of all, the temporal, recognizing that past experiences, present engagements, and future aspirations all inform agency. I'm reminded of our last session I was in there about the future thinking there. Teachers' professional histories and accumulated expertise shape both their current and their future actions. So supporting agency requires attention to each of these four dimensions. I'd like to draw particular attention to the temporal one there, as I strongly believe that the past individual and collective experience, what's nearly interwoven in the fabric and the DNA of the teacher profession, impacts on that current identity and what might be possible into the future. So fundamentally then, if we stay with teacher agency, the socially situated capacity to act is shaped by the interplay of the individual capacities and the structural conditions available. So it's about what the teacher brings to the situation, but it's also about what the situation brings to the teacher. So let's look at the teacher first of all. At a personal and individual level, teachers' sense of agency, or their actual agency, are shaped by their general life histories, and more specifically, their professional histories. An example of this, in an ideal world anyway, would be good initial teacher education that grounds a teacher as a critical, research literate and reflective professional. But of equal, if not a lot more importance, are the ongoing spaces and contexts for teachers to have rich professional and collaborative learning opportunities within their teaching contexts, where problems of practice and pedagogy can be discussed in safe and constructive environments. And this supports the development of both individual and collective professional capital, nurturing beliefs, values, and professional knowledge that imbue teachers with the confidence, the competence, and importantly, the desire to exercise agency within their classrooms and contexts. And if we move then to the context, what does that bring to the teacher? Teachers don't act in a vacuum. Their capacity for agency is very much shaped by formal mandates, relational dynamics, and systemic conditions. And they could fall as cultural, structural, material affordances. These either enable or constrain. They can operate at a local or indeed a national level. Some of the local level ones might be peer dynamics, leadership styles, parental expectations, and they can also emerge at the national level. Some of them might include the curriculum itself, teacher education provisions, the time available for collaborative sense-making and inquiry, accountability mechanisms such as inspection, and so on. So we have to engage with that complex interplay between structural conditions and teachers' capacity to act, and how these might be reimagined or redesigned to enable them to become enablers rather than constraints around agency. If we look then at the second implication around teachers as curriculum makers, and really I do see teacher agency and teacher as curriculum makers as being mutually interrelated and indeed reinforcing. There's now a greater acceptance of curriculum as a living document, as a process, a social construction that is both text and discourse, that's continuously negotiated, reinterpreted at policy and practice levels by a range of partners. And they are understandings that have been advanced by Stephen Ball among many others. This understanding lies in tension with earlier conceptualization of a more center-periphery type of curriculum, which suggested a linear trajectory with teachers at the end point of delivery only, and indeed a sense that the curriculum was developed by experts outside schools for teachers and school leaders to implement within schools. So while there's always been some flexibility around interpretation in the curriculum, presenting the curriculum as a framework rather than a detailed and prescriptive document explicitly repositions teachers as curriculum makers. The curriculum framework now provides an artifact or context that stimulates curriculum making at a local level through professional conversations, sense-making, negotiation, co-construction, and participation from not only teachers but also children, parents, wider stakeholders. And that shifts curriculum away from something to be implemented at the end point to more a process of enactment that requires high levels of professional capacity and confidence on the part of teachers, not only as individuals but as collectives as well, to really bring those policy texts to life as they interact with local school contexts and student needs. So a lot of people have worked in this space, but I'm particularly interested in the work that Mark Priestley and his colleagues have done in developing a useful framing for curriculum making. The model that you see there reconceptualizes curriculum making as a dynamic, relational, non-hierarchical activity that takes place across lots of sites of activity, right from the supranational down to the nano within the classroom, illustrating lots of multi-directional flows of influence and how curriculum making occurs and emerges across various sites. And if we understand curriculum making in this way, it's predicated on the capacity of teachers and school leaders to exercise agency both within their schools and across boundaries. And that transition isn't going to be easy for many of us. In the past, we've worked with maybe a detailed curriculum that provides certainty for us as professionals in terms of our expectations placed on us. A delicate balance is needed in terms of moving away from what we might call the current spiral of specification towards curriculum guidance that provides a balance of clarity and flexibility. And we've seen this tension emerge in Northern Ireland around that specificity. Too much detail can stifle innovation and lead to curriculum making that's more mechanical and instrumental. But conversely, in the absence of detail, it can deprive teachers of the foundational materials that they need in order to construct or be effective curriculum makers in their schools. We also must look beyond the teacher as an individual as well and harness the collaborative potential of teachers as a collective. This has been captured in the NCCA document around supporting system-wide change, which outlines a set of interrelated, conducive conditions for curriculum enactment, including that really important collaborative sense-making. This involves negotiating curriculum decisions together, exploring their effects and potentialities, and interfacing them with that local context and student needs. This shift requires a cultural transformation in some schools, away from individual to more collective and collaborative agency. And that brings me on to the third one, and I think probably the most crucial or the linchpin on which much depends, around system-wide learning and change. Teacher professionalism in the Republic of Ireland is deeply shaped by the structures and dynamics of the broader education system. So collectively there it's quite a busy visual, I know, but it's more for illustrative purposes rather than the detail. It shows you the various levels and layers across the education system, from the supranational on the outside right through to the macro, the meso and the micro level of the classroom. And all of those layers play a really vital role in terms of shaping teacher professionalism. In the Republic of Ireland, the policy development landscape has been characterised by what we might call centralised diffusion, where national agencies, the one there in the dark blue, and departments, produce a wide array of policies. But the busyness there in the dark blue at the national level is not balanced by a regional or school-based infrastructure, shown there in the yellow and the orange, that might be helpful in effectively mediating, interpreting, making sense of, or indeed feeding back upwards into national policy making. So while we have some meso-level infrastructure in the orange, and we have many actors who act as what we might call boundary spanners who travel between the various layers of the system, like inspectors or EDGE support service professionals who are usually teachers on secondment, there's scope, I think, to augment both the formal and the informal networks and to forge stronger multi-directional connections across the system. Strengthening this level would enhance, I suppose, coherence as well as that collaborative professionalism that's there. And to confuse you further then, I'll explain what you're looking at there. It's relatively straightforward to put people in their boxes and in their circles, but that's not life and that's not reality. It's harder, I suppose, to look at or comprehend the interface, the fluidity and the movement between all of these different layers, right down from the supranational, all of these various sites of activity, as Priestley and others have called them. This, I suppose, is a more porous, it shows the borders and the interface between the sites of activity. And essentially the teacher is there nestled within this complex educational landscape. And that landscape determines the extent or the enablers or the constraint around teacher professionalism as they interact with other people and other structures across that education ecosystem. In terms of, I suppose, how can that wider system be harnessed then to create affordances for teacher agency? A key insight from the work of the advisory panel is a need for system-wide learning. So that's a document that was prepared back in 2022. So curriculum redevelopment and enactment work cannot and shouldn't be confined to schools. It has to take place at all of these sites of activity across the system. And this includes fostering spaces and places and fora where teachers, policymakers, support services, inspectors, researchers, ourselves as teacher educators, and all other stakeholders can engage in reciprocal dialogue, share knowledge, co-construct understandings of curriculum and context. And for that, we need lots of trust, collaboration, and parity of esteem. So teachers must be recognised as actors that extend far beyond the classroom or their school environment, and whose professional judgment and contextual expertise are vital to curriculum development inside and outside schools. And I think one thing I've experienced in recent years is that the whole process of curriculum redevelopment, it has taken close to a decade to come to the redeveloped curriculum that we now have. I suppose that shows the educative potential of that engagement and collaboration, where teachers and wider stakeholders from across the system have collaborated in planning the curriculum, the vision, the format, and the content of it. So this, I suppose, introduces that concept of learning together, where everybody comes with responsibility, and where each and every stakeholder brings their own insights, their experience, their expertise, but also their learning needs. There's nobody on that landscape that have all of the answers. It also, I suppose, attempts to flatten the traditional power hierarchies across the system, and it offers a compelling vision for sustainable redevelopment work. So efforts to build greater synergies across the system doesn't only need to look at those structures of governance, but also around the cultures of interaction between all of those sites of activity. And I like the work of Van den Akker. I think he summarizes it well, that we must build lots of bridges between many levels, factors, and actors in terms of harnessing that teacher professionalism. And then to the last implication. Teachers in the Republic of Ireland are recognised for their high calibre, shaped by extended initial teacher education, what we think are very rigorous professional accreditation processes that we've been through, and a continuum of professional learning. And these are very significant developments really over the last decade that have been led by the Teaching Council. And while curriculum making happens at all of the various sites of activity we've looked at, classroom practice remains that critical site of enactment, where teachers' beliefs, experiences, self-efficacy and relationships with students shape how the curriculum is interpreted and constructed into meaningful learning experiences for children. Fullen captures, I think, that essence very well when he talks about that real crunch coming in the relationship between these new ideas and the thousands of subjective realities embedded in people's individual and organisational contexts and their personal histories. So it's really ultimately at that individual teacher and classroom that the curriculum is co-constructed and mediated with and to children. And I suppose that's the place where either meaningful, symbolic, or superficial responses to change are formulated. For me, I think the concept of sense-making holds a lot of potential in understanding the processes necessary to nurture teachers as curriculum makers. It can be defined, as you see there, as a dynamic and interactive process through which both individuals and groups of people construct meaning. So teachers need time and space to engage not only cognitively, but emotionally, affectively, and Viv talked a lot about the affective domain there yesterday, to bring these new ideas, to collaborate with their peers, and integrate new ideas into their existing practices and beliefs. But we have many structural constraints in the Republic of Ireland. High contact hours with pupils, the predominance of small schools and large class sizes, all of those restrict those opportunities for engagement with policy and curriculum. Ultimately then, empowering teachers as professionals and collaborators is not just beneficial or desirable. It's completely essential for curriculum redevelopment to take root and to flourish in classrooms when you're using a curriculum framework. Supporting teacher learning means acknowledging these realities and providing opportunities for reflection, experimentation, risk-taking, creativity, and adaptation. And in a room full of teacher educators, I must mention as well our own role and our central role in teacher preparation and professional learning. Our work in the South is determined by the CAME standards developed by the Teaching Council, while I know there's a plan for the core content framework for ITE in Northern Ireland that will emerge as part of this Transform Ed strategy. And as we continue our work in ITE and beyond, we have to remember that, I suppose, preparing teachers to enact a curriculum framework agentically is quite different to maybe prior roles of preparing teachers to implement a curriculum with some fidelity. And so to conclude, While the conference theme on a new era for professionalism is on that, in many ways our present and our future is very much informed by the legacy of the past. The temporal dimension will always orient conceptualizations of teacher professionalism as they navigate these shifting policies, practices and purposes in schooling, as they're informed by the past, shaped in the present, but with an eye to the future. When we look at the origins of our primary education system across the island and its early decades, they were very much an attempt not only to control and to make standardize the professional work and autonomy of teachers, it was also an effort to place parameters around their social and personal lives and to shape their character in particular ways. Much policy, curriculum policy in the interim, accompanied by wider accountability mechanisms, has continued to provide detailed guidance to shape the professional lives of teachers. It's only more recently, especially in the Republic of Ireland anyway, that we've included this explicit focus on supporting teacher agency at an individual and collective level, and such a shift in direction requires careful nurturing if it is to be realised. In that juxtaposition between the past and the present, between continuity and change, I'm always reminded of the image David Toohey shares in his book on school culture about juggling the role of being settlers and nomads, about holding on to the familiar elements of the past, being the settler, but also the nomads as they move out to new pastures and incorporate elements of development, such as a curriculum change. And as you can see there, he says, in the change process, schools have tried to mix the roles of settlers and nomads. They've kept all the possessions of the past and have also tried to head out for pastures new. The lack of prioritization has meant that teachers have taken on more and more roles and burdens and shed none of the older ones. So I do think that one of the lessons from the past is that we must have the courage to shed some of those practices, roles and routines as we move to embrace newer ones. Otherwise, we can become paralysed by the sheer burden and sense of overload, which militates against any real or meaningful change in practice. So a few parting thoughts then from today, I suppose 4 in particular. First of all, that teacher agency must be enabled and not assumed. Teachers both individually and as a collective need time, trust and support to act agentically. Secondly, that teachers are curriculum enactors and curriculum makers. The curriculum itself is no longer a static document. It's a living, negotiated practice shaped by those who enact it in partnership with one another, children and wider stakeholders. Thirdly, we have to embrace whole system approach to curriculum enactment. Structures and spaces for reciprocal engagement and learning across all the actors from the national to the local must be facilitated to harness and distill collective expertise and experience. And last of all then, that collaboration is the engine of professionalism. We have to foster environments for collective inquiry, collaborative sense-making, mutual respect and shared responsibility, where there's time on an ongoing basis for professional dialogue and where teachers are supported to work across boundaries. So in the new era, teacher professionalism is not defined solely by standards or codes. It's defined by authentic engagement, ethical agency and collaborative practice. The past reminds us the limitations of control and compliance, but the future invites us to reimagine professionalism as a shared, relational and evolving endeavour. So let's have the courage to shed some of those outdated roles and routines that we have and to embrace a vision of professionalism that honours the complexity, the creativity and the capacity of our teachers. So I leave it there. Gur Mahagav. Thank you. So Julie is telling me we do have time for questions, comments, contestations, or anything that anybody would like to offer. Heckles. Don't encourage. Formulating your thoughts. Oh, sorry. Viv, I see you at the back.
Thank you, Tom, for a great presentation there. Early on in your historical analysis, and you were showing the documents, I've obviously noticed the stamp of the British Crown. And it also reminded me of the research of the guy I mentioned yesterday, Patrick Walsh, formerly at Queen's, who studied the British colonial textbook industry that was used predominantly in Ireland, British Canada, and actually parts of England and Wales. The further away you got from London, they were using those textbooks. And they were very much about building loyal British colonial subjects. At what point in that history do you see the emergence of an Irish island and of an Irish citizen and an Irish teacher in the same way that those documents were there to enforce kind of ideas of British Ireland?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. Those readers were they were the curriculum in primary schools from about the 1830s to about the early 1870s. They started to be teachers were allowed to use wider materials at that point. But there wasn't a huge amount of resources. The Gaelic League and some more cultural organisations started to produce some texts in the 1890s, early 1900s. It really was only after political independence where there was a move to develop quite quickly a range of textbooks and resources, I suspect on both sides of the border, that captured and cultivated the national identity, and it was very much schools were seen and teachers were seen at the forefront of that mission of building a new identity, both north and south, that would I suppose try to create in many instances, because there hadn't been an Irish identity in the new format for hundreds of years at that point. But that took a long time in terms of the development of resources, certainly in the Gaelic language. They very much took decades and standardization of the dialects and so on. But those readers were really powerful, and they were a really powerful tool around teacher professionalism also, because the role of the teacher very much was to read and interpret and to convey the content of those. So it not only shaped children's learning, they were used in the training colleges, and it very much shaped teachers' understanding of knowledge that they conveyed. Great, thank you. Are we all good? Oh, another question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for a really, really interesting talk. Just one specific point, I suppose, you talk about the curriculum enactor and curriculum maker, and that tension in Northern Ireland is sort of having one particular, they're looking at putting in more detail, and we're in our new primary framework looking at maybe more of a framework and less specificity. My question is around how you think the new primary framework and that move towards a broader sort of framework might have an impact on initial teacher education programs, or how they need to change in order to give these skills and allow the teachers to become more curriculum makers rather than enactors.
Yeah, really good question. And I do think, looking at that landscape, there is no point in changing the curriculum if it's business as usual, say in initial teacher education, in inspection, in support services and so on. So I do think as initial teacher educators, we have to look at what the teachers of the future are going to be doing. So rather than heading off with the heavy box like many of us might have done after initial teacher education, and there was a lot of detail there, there is going to be need for that time and space, both within initial teacher education and giving the skills into the future for teachers to be able, and student teachers to be able to sit together to work out what this might look like in a particular class or context. And I know that the NCCA are developing toolkits then which will probably support some of that work. I think they'll be useful for teachers, but I think they'll also be very useful for initial teacher educators in terms of understanding how to go about doing that. And I think we also need to rely on the professionalism of teachers in terms of the extended education that they have, the high caliber on entry, and give trust and space for that to happen. It may not be a wonderful success all of the time. I mentioned risk-taking. I think it's really important to try things new, make those mistakes perhaps and move onward from there and learn from that. So I think rather than maybe that compliance or that feeling that there's a right way and a wrong way of doing this, that there's so many different ways. And I think that's the exciting bit of this curriculum, in terms of opening up all those possibilities about how this curriculum might feel and look and be experienced by pupils across the country. I think it'll be very rich. Thank you. And I'll leave it there. I'm getting a nod. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tom, for taking us in your time machine. It's always good on a Friday morning to head off in a time machine, but to help us understand how our past is informing our present, and also, again, our vision for the future, which I think is very important when we're at a conference, that we start to vision the future as well.